So thank you both for joining us. Thanks you everyone as well. This is the talk number 3 for VERGE Talks. And this week we have Zuzana&Nicholas from Brisbane. So we've been making our way up from Melbourne to Sydney and now up to Brisbane, up the east coast of Australia. And we're almost at the northern tip, but we're not going to quite make it there. So Zuzana&Nicholas is a small Brisbane-based practice formed in 2013, primarily focused on residential work and with an active interest in teaching, research, and exhibition design. The practice has developed a reputation for small-scale, sensitive alterations and additions to traditional housing, which has been recognised through Houses Awards, including the 2021 Alterations and Additions under 200 metres squared for Annerley House in 2024, and the Year Award for Red Hill House and Studio. So we're eager to hear more about your practice, so over to you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. So we'll just start by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yagara people, the traditional custodians of the land from which we speak today, and pay respect to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So this is us. We're a small 2-person practice. This is us in the studio. We're primarily working in single private residential work, but we also have an active interest in teaching, research, and exhibition design and arts practice. So we both graduated from the University of Queensland. We also undertook PhDs through RMIT. Zuzana's was in the traditional mode with some components of project work, and ended up being published in the form of a monograph, which is on the left there. My PhD was by project through RMIT. And sort of coincided with the formation of our practice in 2013, and involved a lot of making and testing and thinking through the PhD that sort of forms the early parts of our practice. Over the years, we've done a lot of teaching at the University of Queensland, and Zuzana also held a lecturing position at Griffith University on the Gold Coast in Queensland up until early this year. And Zuzana is still an adjunct lecturer at Griffith. These drawings are from a studio that we ran at UQ that was the early kind of research component. But that studio involved measuring and analysing shop fronts around Brisbane. But the kind of the main core of our practice at the moment is residential work. We're predominantly working in the sort of inner city of Brisbane, and almost all of our work involves altering and adding to and renovating existing vernacular housing stock in the inner city. And that's a little bit of a cross-section of our work there. And Lucas has asked us to kind of touch on the kind of context that we're practicing in terms of other touch points for architects in Australia. And rather than looking at kind of historical precedents, we wanted to, I guess, look at a little bit of a cross-section of some of the small contemporary practices that some of which are friends, all of which are practices that we admire. So maybe take a screenshot of this and take a look at some of these practices in your own time. But there's kind of an incredible wealth of small practices across the country that are doing really interesting work. One practice in particular that whose work we really admire and kind of speaks to what we're interested in is Barako Wright from Melbourne. They have an interesting practice. They hold academic positions, so they're teaching and researching as well as practicing. this image and the thumbnail of the publication is from their project Repair, which was exhibited at the 2018 Venice Biennale in the Australian Pavilion. And that project was formed by growing plants that were transported as seeds from Australia. And they talk about the idea that the project sort of confronts just the simple fact that architecture occupies land. And the exhibition was intended as a kind of provocation to architects to think about what is displaced when we make a work of architecture. They also talk about ideas of being generous to the place in which you're working, being generous to the place in which a work of architecture is situated, and ideas of repairing principally land and country and the environment, but also extending that idea of repair to culture and social repair and repair and parts of maintenance of buildings. And that's something that kind of speaks to us in terms of our interests in what we're looking at in our residential practice. And you can see that sensibility comes through in the project work. So this is one recent example. There are no full completed photographs yet, but this is an alteration to a fairly banal single-story brick veneer house in the suburbs of Melbourne. And it takes what would have been probably a 2 or 3 bedroom house. It was probably pretty banal and not very generous in its proportions or spatially, and opens it up in a way where it removes almost all of the internal partitions, removes the back wall of the house, and opens it to the garden. The garden was forthcoming, I understand. And so it takes something that's kind of fairly ordinary and turns it into something that has a kind of generosity. And it also does so without adding footprints, and it preserves the without it adding building footprint, that is, and it preserves the green space around it. Another project, Garden House, I think speaks to this idea of generosity to the place that it's sited. So it's a holiday house that's kind of envisioned as almost more tent than house, and it has a kind of gentle relationship with the landscape that's allowed to sort of pass underneath it and through it. And so it's not a kind of architecture often has a fairly kind of dominant relationship with the landscape that it's in. And I think this house has quite a kind of gentle and generous relationship to the place that it's in. And just for some context, so this is an Indigenous map of First Nations language groups across the country. We're over here in Brisbane, which sits on Yagara country. And this is the little dot in the middle is our studio. This is sort of Greater Brisbane. The Pacific Ocean is out here, Stradbroke Island, Moreton Island and Moreton Bay, and the Brisbane River, and the CBD is just here. And so this is the kind of, this is inner Brisbane, which is where most of our work takes place. And the CBD in the middle here. And really this whole area is sort of pretty heavily urbanized. And the sort of suburbs that surround it, mostly where we work. And although it does have a sort of proper urban CBD, the context that we're working in is more like this. So this is a suburb kind of basically just down the street, about 100 meters down the street from us, where we're talking from now. And so it's in a city. It's only about 2 kilometres from the city centre, but it looks like this. So it's colonial vernacular housing stock. These houses are probably 100 to 110 years old. Timber, weatherboard, Queenslander houses and cottages perched on the side of the hill. A lot of Brisbane's pretty hilly, so you get these kind of vistas across the suburb from one ridge to another. And even though it does have a kind of a city centre, a lot of the context that we're working in doesn't feel particularly urban. It feels more like this kind of image. And the existing housing stock that dominates the inner city, which is all protected from demolition by the planning codes, are these cottages and Queenslanders. So they're raised on stumps above the ground, some close to the ground than others. Others are full story out of the ground. Some of them are, or many of them are renovated, like the one in the bottom image, but many of them are also a little bit ramshackle and kind of overtaken by greenery. You also get these incredible moments where the topography falls away steeply towards the rear of the house, and you get sort of sometimes 1.5 to 2 stories out of the ground here. And this is quite an extreme example, but it's not untypical with Brisbane. And a unique situation to Brisbane is that with these houses being on stumps and being lightweight timber framed construction, they can be elevated and lifted on stumps, and sometimes they're even put on the back of a truck and relocated out of town, which probably sounds kind of pretty remarkable in a different context. It also affords an opportunity to build under. Often that doesn't result in a good outcome. Often people are just hungry for square meterage and extending footprints. But an image such as this is not unusual to encounter in Brisbane. And this is the other context that we're working in. So Australia is at the top of the list in terms of average house size in the world at 214 square metres as of last year. And so houses are big here. And we're often kind of working against that, trying to advocate to our clients to build less, work with what they have, preserve green space around the buildings, even reduce footprint in the interests of improving access to light and ventilation and increasing green space. And although the existing vernacular has a kind of wonderful character, often what we encounter when we first start a project is something more like this. So these are images of 3 of our projects that we'll talk about this evening. And these are the backs of the houses. Often they've been modified over the past 100 years in a pretty unsympathetic manner. They've been added to and altered in ways that disconnect them from the garden, and they're in a state of disrepair somewhat. So often our projects are about trying to modify what is there in order to kind of open these buildings back up to their surroundings and particularly the green space around them.
I might take over here. So as Nick said, we'll speak to these 3 projects from the previous slide. And the first one we're going to start with is the Annerley House. The Annerley House is, again, in an inner city suburb of Brisbane. This is sort of part of the project, part of the extension at the rear of the house. So the house in its sort of, when the commission came to us in its sort of original footprint was what we're seeing here on the slide. So it was a 2-bedroom house. It had a kitchen at the rear, which had a really poor connection to the backyard through a tiny little window. And then there was a toilet and laundry space on the back of the house as well. So the house was very disconnected from the backyard. The laundry space at the rear was basically crumbling into the ground. It was poorly built, and there were structural issues with it. So the sort of the brief for us from the client was to improve the connection to the backyard. The client had 2 young children, and also to add an extra living space onto the garden and a flexible 3rd bedroom. So just some quick photographs of the existing condition. This is the laundry space at the rear of the cottage. So you can see that it's it's relatively sort of close down to the backyard. It separates the kitchen, dining, living spaces of the house from the backyard. So you essentially have to walk through this service space to get outside. And the kitchen in its existing condition and the tiny little set of louver windows in terms of the sort of showing you the limited connection to the garden. So this is the proposed plan, and you can see that there's a little bit of a reconfiguration of the interior. The laundry at the rear gets removed, and a new living space gets inserted in its location, as well as a bathroom and laundry behind that. So in terms of a diagram, as Nick was saying earlier, generally, but also in reference to Barako Wright's work, who I think are really important to us as a touchstone. A lot of the sort of ambitions we have for projects in our practice is about trying to convince people to build less and to build spaces that are flexible, that have multiple functions, and that create positive relationships to the front yard or the backyard or to neighbours. And quite often those are the sort of issues that the houses that we get as projects, the sort of issues they have. So here in this diagram, the green fill shows the new build, the extent of the new build. The grey is within the existing footprint, and within that footprint there was a reconfiguration of the kitchen and dining space. And then the addition in the green. And then the pink lines are about just indicating some of the kind of key visual and the physical connections that we try to create with the renovation. And one of the other sort of ideas for this project from a sort of a material perspective was to think about the extension and the ground being made in masonry, so in concrete and a stone terrace, so that material was fitting to sit adjacent the garden. And when large doors are opened up, then there's a kind of a freedom of movement between inside and outside, and you're dealing with quite a robust material for the floor that is fitting both as an interior as well as an outdoor room. And then taking cues from the existing tin roof and the sort of shape of the tin roof, and creating a kind of a hat for the extension that acknowledges that materiality. And so you can see that idea of the top of the extension in these images, connecting or taking cues from the existing roof. You can start to see the living room extension, which is essentially kind of a story and a half in terms of the height. And you can see the existing cottage to the right of each of the photos as well, and the new large opening that was created in the back of that cottage to open up the kitchen and dining space to the garden. So the new little extension for the living room, as well as the making of a new window for the kitchen, we're all about creating a positive connection to the outdoor space and creating a little sort of courtyard that they pivot around. And then the living space obviously opens onto the backyard proper as well. And the view from the living room out into the courtyard, and you can see the sliding window into the kitchen. On the left-hand side as well. And the window is given depth so that it acts as a bay window, and it receives morning light, and so it becomes this kind of place where you can have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee in the morning. And there's a tiny little study that's also included above the living room as an additional space for the children to go and spend time in. And then a set of photographs that explain the connection from the existing cottage. So the image on the left, we're walking through the hallway of the existing cottage, through a new reveal into the renovated kitchen dining space with a view beyond through the living room into the garden. So quite often the houses we're working with suffer from there not being a direct visual connection to an exterior space from the front door, even though that would have been present originally when the houses were built. So a lot of the times it becomes about trying to open up kind of key sight lines, also to sort of create a sense of spatial generosity, because a lot of these houses aren't actually that large in terms of their footprint. And the photograph on the right, you can see we're in the kitchen with the new bay window, and that's our client there sitting in the window overlooking the garden, with then the living space to the right-hand side. The second project that we're going to talk about is the West End House. This is a recently completed project. It's a project for the same client from Annerley House. So our client from Annerley House had 2 young children when we did that project for her. And as her children grew, and they sort of required more space and different types of spaces, she sold Annerley House and she bought a different cottage in a different part of Brisbane, and asked us to renovate that as well. And so that's West End House here. This job was a little bit different to Annerley House. There was a little bit more substantial work that we did to this project. It's a project that got lifted. So the original house got lifted and built under. So if you think back to the photograph that Nick showed with that Queenslander perched up, this is exactly what happened to this house. This is the original plan when our client purchased the house. The house had been quite significantly modified from what it would have originally been when it was built about 100 years ago. But again, it sort of suffered from a lot of the sort of similar issues that the previous project suffered from. So there's a disconnection with the backyard. There was sort of insufficient space to house the family, and there was no connection to the front yard as well. So West End, where this project is located, is a very sort of vibrant community where a lot of neighbours are friends, and there's a lot of people sort of walking along the streets, and the client wanted to be generous to the street in terms of how the house might open out onto the street and provide spaces where her children might play and have their friends come over and engage as well. So this is a photograph of the house from the rear during construction. And you can see that the house has been lifted. It's obviously excavation work happening underneath it. and it has been re-stumped as well on steel posts. You get a little bit of a sense on the upper level as well in terms of the connection that it had to the backyard. So again, it's quite closed down to the rear, and so a lot of the project was about reworking that. And this is what the house looks like post renovation. So we added a veranda to the top and a small little bay window on the lower level. But other than that, the extension remains within the sort of the footprint of the upper level. So some of the key ideas for this project were to, again, sort of minimise how much we encroach on the lot. So the lot is what's classified as a small lot, and you can see that it's not a very large block. And the client was really, as well, was interested in preserving the garden and not encroaching on it or minimising the amount that we encroached on it. So the area shaded in pink is the only element of new build that moves beyond the extent of the original house. And obviously that we've got the lower plan up the top, and then down the bottom we have the upper plan, and down below there was nothing underneath the house when it was purchased by the client. It was just raised on stumps, and it was sort of a storage laundry space, so very sort of informal space. The other sort of key idea for this project was to create a series of voids throughout the plan that connected the upper and lower levels. One of the problems that quite often happens with lifting the Queenslanders and building under is that there's a disconnection between the two levels, and quite often the way that they're programmed is that you might have bedrooms and private spaces on one level and then the public spaces on another level. And so we were trying to make sure that there's a connection between the top and lower levels through the insertion of a number of voids, but they're also important for obviously bringing light down into the lower level. So there's one near the entry space as you enter, quite a small one, and there's a very generous one over the kitchen dining space. And for this, the client made the decision to essentially lose what could have potentially been an additional bedroom, because she understood the sort of the value of creating that double height space and the sort of the light filtering through. And then there's a third one above the little sort of triangular bay window, more garden. And so in these images, you can start to get a little bit of a sense of the project sitting in its context. And the sort of context of West End is quite informal in terms of the sort of the backyards and the way that boundaries between lots are formed. Quite often the boundaries are very simple chain wire, low chain wire fences. And so you essentially are getting this kind of green belt that is formed by backyards being joined together, and people borrowing space from each other visually. And that was one of the key things that we wanted to participate in, and hence why we didn't want to encroach on that. And on the photo on the right, you can see the added veranda on the upper level, which provides a bit of an overhang and shelter for the large sliding doors into the kitchen, dining and living space, and a concrete sort of steps that act as a little sort of amphitheatre onto the backyard. And coming inside, we have the kitchen and dining space, which opens to the garden on the right-hand side. And you can start to see that large void in the space as well, and that void opens up onto the master bedroom upstairs, as well as a study. And then a view from the study upstairs, looking back down through the void into the kitchen space. So you can imagine that, there can be people upstairs, obviously using the study, the children, for example, and they can talk to their mum who's cooking downstairs, and there's this quite lovely sort of relationships are in between the two levels. And then a view on the right-hand side to the garden beyond. And in this view, you get a little bit of the large void on the left, and then the bay window on the right with its void, which connects up to the study above. And the other sort of nice thing to sort of note in this photo is the sort of the porosity of the gardens, the connection of the gardens, and the house beyond the pool that we're looking at here is a neighbouring house. And so all of the houses are quite close to each other, but they all look onto and share this lovely sort of green belt and borrow from one another. And then the void at the front door. So on the right-hand side, this is the entry with the front door, and you get a little bit of a view of that void to the top of the photo. And on the left-hand side, we're upstairs looking down into the void and down the hallway that connects all of the bedrooms and bathrooms through to the rear veranda. And the final project we're going to touch on tonight was the Red Hill House and Studio. This project is our own house and studio. So we live upstairs and we work downstairs. And much like the previous two projects, our house, again, is a workers' cottage, a Queenslander, about 100 years old. And had a number of detrimental renovations done to it when we purchased it. So it was far from what it would have been like in its original condition. These are plans of what the house was like when we bought it in 2011. So up the top we have the upper plan, and then down the bottom we have the lower plan. It was a 2-bedroom house. It still is a 2-bedroom house. And upstairs was the main sort of part of the house. Downstairs, the house was on concrete stumps. It had concrete slabs throughout, but it was very informal in terms of the way that it was made. It was badly made, so it had all sorts of problems. And it was essentially just the storage space, laundry space, and a bathroom down there. So for the first, I don't know how many years, 10 years or so, we worked on the house ourselves, meaning literally building a lot of it ourselves and designing it all ourselves. And we sort of renovated the house room by room. And because a lot of the original fabric, as well as the sort of the original plan, had been stripped out of the house through prior renovations by prior owners, there was a kind of a need for us to think about how we would react to the existing house and how we would intervene in it. So rather than trying to replace what would have been there 100 years ago and replicate that, we tried to learn from some of the details, like single-skinned walls with timber chamfer boards, and replicate those details through the way that we renovated these rooms. So this is bedroom, and a lot of this kind of work was essentially thought of as pieces of joinery that were inserted within the existing shell of the house. This is the plans. So these are the plans of what the house looks like now. Again, upper level at the top, lower level down the bottom. So when we did the work on the house, we sort of focused on the original core of the cottage. One of the key things we did was flip the arrangement of the rooms. So we placed the bedrooms onto the darker southern side of the house, and we shifted the public spaces, so the living room, kitchen, and dining space onto the northern side of the house. More recently, we engaged a builder to do some more significant work on the house, which included renovating the upper rear of the house to have a dining space, a bathroom upstairs, a new stair, which connects to the lower studio. And then as part of that project, we did the studio downstairs, laundry and garage space as well. So formalising all of the sort of the informal spaces downstairs. And again, similarly to the diagram for the Annerley House, the pink lines here are trying to indicate some of the kind of the key visual lines that were driving the sort of placement of windows and programming of rooms, trying to create sort of generosity in the plan and connection to green spaces. So starting with downstairs, this is our studio. So the studio gets entered off the side street. The house itself has the entry on the sort of the upper part of the street on Main Street. So there's a completely sort of separate entry for obviously for the house and for if we have friends visiting versus people coming to see us for work. The studio downstairs is made with robust materials, similarly to the Annerley House. So we've got concrete floors and upturns and rendered concrete block walls. So materials that are fitting to be used externally in a garden as well as within a commercial sort of architectural studio space. And the studio is made in such a way that it has large sliding doors on two sides, which can fully peel away if the weather's right. And you're essentially sitting in an outdoor room on the edge of a garden. This is the house with the most recent work. So probably looks a little bit scary and looks like it's sinking into the ground. But so similarly, again, to the images that we've already seen of Queenslanders propped up, this is what happened to the house as well. So the structure got removed and it got propped up on these stacks of timber and excavated underneath to the required levels. Because these houses are the age they are considered character houses and they are protected from demolition. So you're not allowed to change the roof lines. You're not allowed to sort of do anything to the exterior, especially to the front or to the sides that face the street. What you do at the rear is a little bit flexible, but there are pretty sort of tight constraints. And that same sort of view, we're in the backyard again, as per this shot, and you can start to get a little bit of a sense of the renovated project. So we have the studio downstairs. You can see a stair on the left-hand side, which takes you to the residence, to the house upstairs, and you can see a little bit of the dining space up the top as well. And then pulling further back into the garden. So the rear elevation got remade as part of the most recent work, and it was envisaged essentially as a sort of sliding doors and windows, and having a series of spaces that overlooked the garden and borrowed from it. And then going upstairs, you arrive in essentially an area which is our bathroom. So on the left-hand side, we have behind the sort of the greyish blue walls, we have a shower and a toilet, and then a basin at the end, and also a sort of bookshelf. So this space works very hard to fit a lot of program in it. And then the other part to this project was the renovation of the rear of the house as well, which is our dining room, and essentially opening up the rear wall so that when that's opened up, you're just left with a balustrade, and you have a lovely connection to the backyard. And there's no need to sort of add additional spaces like a deck or an external space. The dining space becomes, again, another sort of outdoor room. And yeah, we'll leave it there and open up for some questions.
Awesome. Thank you both very much. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed the Queenslander photos of them being raised up there. They're great photos. And also the context is quite interesting, especially when you're talking about West End with the boundaries. I think it's something here which is kind of quite foreign and maybe quite different. So questions, I might kick off with a question just to get the ball rolling. You kind of touched on a bit of the kind of the context of Queensland. And as we've been moving up from Melbourne to Sydney up to Brisbane, the context has changed quite a bit in what seems like not very far, but really it is quite far. And I'm wondering about these like changes in the context of Brisbane that you have to work with. So like the parameters and some of these touch points, which maybe are challenging sometimes, like, you know, raising the Queenslander up. I know flooding is a big thing as well. So could you maybe touch on some of these points which are kind of maybe constraints to building climate or otherwise?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the big differences between, say, Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, and probably other cities across the country as well, is that is that our vernacular housing stock is timber framed and elevated above the ground, whereas Sydney and Melbourne are, you know, predominantly the vernacular is masonry and on the ground. And I guess the other big differentiator is that it's pretty rare in Brisbane to have attached housing, you know, like terrace housing or row housing. And that came about just through the thinking in planning law as subdivisions were made in Brisbane in the early formation of the city. For whatever reason, they chose to not kind of plan the suburbs in a way that allowed for attached housing. And so that kind of creates this context where it's all detached housing, and it's sort of timber framed and elevated. It gives the opportunity, you know, we have the, I guess, the benefit of space in Brisbane. The properties are relatively generous in terms of the amount of available land to build on as compared to Sydney and Melbourne, let's say, as far as the inner city is concerned. But therefore, the tendency is to try and capitalise on that space and use up as much of it as possible. And people are often doing that either by lifting and building under, or building out into the backyard and consuming as much of it as possible. And we're usually trying to encourage people to
do the opposite.
To do the opposite and preserve as much of that green space as possible. For a couple of reasons, like there's some obvious benefits in terms of financially, there's a benefit to the client is one thing, if they can accept the compromise of more compact, flexible spaces. But obviously there's an environmental imperative just to build less. But also you can imagine the kind of passion that develops if everyone consumes their backyard with building. What used to be with that kind of transparency of the boundary with sort of fairly open, low height fences, those backyards join together to become a kind of a larger green space that benefits everyone. But if everyone builds to the extent it's allowable and consumes their backyard, then no one gets the kind of benefit from that shared space. So yeah, I think that they're kind of some of the bigger challenges that we're working with in Brisbane. I think is just the expectation for space and the way that the kind of the expected way to treat the property and green space that we're working against. I guess we have the benefit of a very benign climate, even more so than Sydney or Melbourne. It doesn't get particularly cold here, but it also doesn't get. I mean, it's all relative, of course, but it doesn't get. It gets pretty hot and humid, but they're far hotter and more humid and more uncomfortable places further to the north. So we're kind of right in the middle. We're subtropical, so our houses can be open for much of the year. So we tend to be able to have large openings. Like our studio, for the most part, is open for the most of the year. We don't have to mechanically ventilate. So we're lucky in that regard.
Awesome. It's really interesting, especially about the climate not needing to ventilate, which is not the case here at all, and especially heating here.
Yeah.
Right. Other questions? Yep.
Thank you for the interesting talk. I found it especially interesting to see about the vernacular houses in Brisbane, which is something completely different to the context here in Switzerland or in Germany, where I'm from, where vernacular housing would be more than 100 years old. But also I was surprised that there is such like even 100-year-old houses, because I thought that the building stock is much longer. But what my question is getting into is in the introduction, you talked about your approach to architecture and that the notion of repair is quite important for you. And my question specifically goes about the garden house. And you said that you wanted to create a gentle and generous relation to the context. And I'm wondering, so how much does it repair the context? Or in this case, is it just not destroying the context as much?
I think just to kick off, just to be clear, that's not our project, and that's Melbourne practice Baracco right, but and the idea of repair is something that they speak about a lot, but it's, I guess, something that speaks to us and our interests. But I think, perhaps repair might not be the right word for that particular project. You're probably right in the sense that it's maybe being conscious of the impact of that particular house on its context. But it's also, I guess, allowing vegetation and plant communities to regenerate. And so, minimal footings and lifting the house up and allowing that plant community to regenerate. A lot of their research is more about probably semi-natural areas that are adjacent urban areas or adjacent industrial areas, and identifying those as important landscapes that often overlooked, and thinking about how they might be regenerated and connected back into the kind of broader natural systems. What would you say?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and I guess for us, obviously, what we do with our work is probably quite different to the work that Baracco Wright do. But for us, sort of the idea of repair or maintenance is about essentially working with these existing 100-year-old or more buildings, and trying to think about how do you sensitively work with them, how do you sensitively repair them, what should be kept, and what needs to sort of be peeled away, and then how do you add the least amount, so that you're not sort of encroaching on the garden, and you're allowing that to regenerate as well, and become part of the sort of the green belt of gardens within a given suburb. So it's a little bit, I guess, different to the way that Barako and Wright work with those terms, but for us, I think we approach it that way.
I think the sensibility might be similar. Like it might be as simple as looking for opportunities to remove external hardscape from projects. So often we might come to an existing house and, there's a concrete driveway for cars, and then the side garden is all concreted, and there's a concrete terrace at the rear, and huge amounts of the site covered in non-permeable ground surface. And so looking to kind of pull all of that up and reinstate gardens, or reinstate, even if it's trafficable surface, making sure that it's permeable. As Lucas alluded to, flooding is an issue in Brisbane, and water movement is an issue in Brisbane. So permeable surface helps with allowing some of that water to get to ground, as opposed to sort of going straight into the stormwater system. It might also be about often those collective backyards that we spoke about, often running through there are overland flow paths for water, and building into those paths disrupts that, as does non-permeable ground surface. So it might be as simple as looking for opportunities like that, which are kind of a little bit outside of the brief that someone might come with for renovating a house and upgrading their amenity, looking for little opportunities like that to kind of repair the site and allow it to kind of function in a way that's more sort of sympathetic to the natural context, I guess.
Interesting. Thank you.
Awesome. If you're online, if you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself. Otherwise, in person. Oh, we've got one more in person. Hey guys, thank you for your talk. It's very interesting to hear about how your work relates very specifically to the context of Brisbane. You mentioned certain design moves, such as creating double height spaces, and that maybe sacrificing like an extra bedroom upstairs. And then also in response to Lucas's question, you talked about resisting the urge to like take up as much available space as possible and reducing the green space in favor of more floor area. Are those ever tough conversations to have with clients, or do you find this pushback, or how do you sort of push those design choices?
Yeah, I think a lot of it obviously does come down to the clients that you have as a practice. I think it's all well and good to have ambitions, but if you have clients who don't share those ambitions or sort of views on the world and living, then it becomes a little bit tricky to get things over the line. So I think we've been sort of lucky on a number of projects where you can argue for and you can explain the sort of the rationale behind some of these key moves, and that you can actually convince someone that there is much more benefit to, for example, losing a bedroom, instead of that having this kind of generosity in the volume and allowing for northern light to filter down into the space that otherwise wouldn't happen. And I think so it definitely does take the right client to sort of agree to those things and be on board with it. But I think the more of those things you get across the board, and the more projects you have that demonstrate that, the easier it is to then with future clients to convince people of those moves and the value of them.
Great. Thank you so much. Awesome. Anyone online want to ask a question? Otherwise, we can maybe just leave it there. Don't think anyone else can ask one. Awesome. We might leave it there. It's just gone 1 o'clock. So yeah. So yeah, thank you both for a great talk. It was really interesting, especially the context, and the projects were really nicely detailed and finished as well, which is really nice.
Thanks for having us.